Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carter Malkasian. I work here at CNA, and we're here to welcome you today to our National Security Seminar, NSS. We'll be talking today about reimagining defense strategy, and our guest today is Christian Brose, author of Kill Chain, and also someone who's accomplished many other things in his career and is continuing to do so. So I'm glad everyone is here today. On behalf of Catherine McGrady, our president, I'd like to welcome you here to the event. I'd like to give you a few administrative notes before we start. First, today's recording is on the record. And a recording of today's event will be available on our site if you'd like to share it or read it later on. The discussion today is going to be a moderated discussion, and we're going to have some discussion and issues between myself and Chris for some amount of time. And we're going to open everything up to question and answer from the audience. So if you're in the audience and you're on Zoom, you just go ahead and look at the bottom of your screen where you can see there's a Q&A function. And you can press that Q&A and you can put in your question at any time in the discussion. Now, if you are not on Zoom, then go ahead and send your question to the address by which you got an invitation to this. And that should be CNA_NSS@cna.org. And if you send the questions there, we'll also be able to put them into the Q&A and be able to ask those questions there. So really appreciate your participation, and we definitely value and need the questions from the audience to get to the deepest depths of reimagining defense strategy. So this National Security Seminar is something we attempt to do from time to time. It's meant to bring together thought leaders and other key leaders from across DoD and the interagency overall to discuss issues that are extremely important and pertinent to national defense, or actually just foreign policy today. And today's discussion, we're going to talk about reimagining defense strategy, but this really is a continuation from a conversation that we started last week about preparing for tomorrow's threats. We see it as the natural development and progression of those discussions. And so what we want to talk about today is how a reimagined national defense strategy might encourage Congress and the defense establishment to adapt and spur the right innovations to succeed in future conflict. And of course, talk about some of the challenges that exist for that kind of innovation and how we might overcome it. So for that discussion today, we're joined today by Mr. Christian Brose. He is the author of Kill Chain, Defending America and the Future of High-Tech Warfare. This is a very highly regarded book that came out last year, has gotten excellent reviews, and has been read throughout the DoD. I suspect that many of our members of the audience have read it thoroughly. So Chris is the Chief Strategy Officer at Anduril Industries. He's also a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. Previously, many of us know him from his time as the staff director on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And before that, as a senior policy advisor to Senator John McCain. He was a very familiar face for those of us who spent time in Afghanistan, or for those of us who have worked on the Joint Staff or an OSD. Prior to that, he was a policy advisor and speechwriter for Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and he also worked before that for Secretary of State Colin Powell. So we're really honored and lucky to have such a skilled and experienced person here today to have these discussions with us. Like I said, Kill Chain is a very well-known book, a book that has spearheaded the discussion on innovation today in the Department of Defense, and spearheaded discussion about what our new national defense strategy should look like. And in this book, he talks about how the United States could lose an armed conflict against a peer competitor such as China. And he talks about what are some things we could do to prevent that from happening. So, with those points made and that introduction for the discussion that we're going to have today, I'd like to begin the moderated discussion with Chris. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the book Kill Chain and how he came to writing it. I'm very interested in why you chose the exact title Kill Chain. It is also very provocative and immediately makes you want to read the book and makes it feel like this is about something extremely lethal that we need to deal with. But when I read the book, I also think about what I think when I hear it is you are making an argument that what we've been doing in the past is wrong. We need to focus on this thing called the kill chain. And what you're saying is, when I hear it, I think what you're really saying is the military should stop worrying about legacy platforms and start worrying about command and control, ISR, enabling technologies, and ability to strike the opponent over a long range, because that's where a kill chain really comes in to be important. I'm struck by your quote. The main goal in future conflict will be accelerating the ability to close the kill chain and break the rival's ability to do so. So my question then is, am I interpreting this correctly? Did I infer things properly?
Yeah, I think you've got it basically right. And let me just first of all, thank you, Carter, for convening this. Thank you and CNA for the phenomenal work that you do. Particularly during my time in government, really relied on the phenomenal expertise, analysis work that was done by CNA, that continues to be done by CNA. So thank you very much. It's just an honor to have the opportunity to be with you. To your question, I think you do have it basically right. And that was basically the intent in writing the book. And sort of the reason I embrace the concept of the kill chain, used as the title. And the thing that I would say here is, like, this isn't new, right? I mean, I'm not like coining this term. People have been talking about kill chains and OODA loops for a very long time. And there's a reason. I think it's because this is actually the purpose of military power. This is actually how we generate deterrence. But what has struck me, particularly in my time in government, the more I worked in the national defense space, is that this isn't really how our defense enterprise actually conceives, builds, buys, evaluates, assesses military power. We don't think in terms of kill chains. We think in terms of platforms. We aspire to a 355 ship Navy, and other things. But that, to my mind, isn't really what matters. Those are tools. Sort of a quick relevant aside, Senator McCain asked me at one point, one of our many conversations, like, what is wrong with our kind of defense enterprise? And, my kind of point of reference or analogy was, one of my favorite books, Moneyball, and one of his. And basically the analogy is, look, for over a century, baseball was asking the wrong questions. It measured value in terms of buying players. It looked for value in things like batting average and number of home runs. But the goal isn't to buy players, it's to buy wins. And to buy wins, you have to buy runs. And to buy runs, you need to get on base, and you can get on base a lot of ways. So the reason, this book was one of my favorite books, and I find it like so, analogous to the problems we're dealing with in DoD, is that it wasn't really a book about baseball. It was a book about, the destruction of an old paradigm that asked the wrong questions and led to just a fundamental misallocation of resources, and the creation of a new paradigm that looked at players in the context of what they contributed to the actual outcome, which is winning games. And I think that, to me, is sort of like the point we're at here in national defense. Like, I made the kill chain the organizing concept of my book because I believe that is the thing that we actually value. That is the thing that we are actually spending money to buy. That's the actual outcome. We value the ability to integrate military systems to improve human understanding, human decision-making, human action, to enable us to operate faster, better, at larger scales, more autonomously, less costly. It's that, I think, that generates, kind of real advantage and real deterrence. I also think it's the right way to think about this question that many of us, have been wrestling with for a long time, of like, how do I kind of evaluate and make sense of all of these emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, robotics, autonomy. And there too, I think, like, where those systems, where those technologies really can, kind of shine is if we're looking at this question the right way, which is, how do they advance and accelerate and improve understanding, decision-making, and action? So yeah, to your point, it's not all about the kind of end of that process that I find we focus so much on, the lethality, the fires. It is about everything that has to happen to the left of that in order to make this, a capability that is actually something that can outcompete a competitor or outcompete an adversary, particularly at a time where they are actively trying to disrupt, disable, break our ability to understand, decide, and act. Like, to me, that is the fundamental military competition that we have been involved in for, all of human history, and that's not going to change. But we need to look at this problem the right way, or we're going to make a whole lot of the wrong decisions about how we prepare for the future.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm glad I understood some of that properly. I think The kill chain, I think, is something that many of the people in our audience understand. And I've always liked to think that I understand it. But I certainly had the experience that over time, learning more on the joint staff and other places, that I've gained a larger understanding of how it's important, and how we have to think about some of the technologies and what they can do in those terms, because without aspects of the kill chain, parts of it won't work. And also how the kill chain changes and morphs over time. It's not static.
Right.
It's always being affected one way or another. And so I often think about it that this is really more like a competition over parts of the kill chain, somewhat analogous to like the competition in the Second World War over technology to defeat U-boats versus the U-boat technology, or technology to strike Germany with strategic bombers versus their ability to defend. Something that's always changing, we have to be working on.
Right.
So with that said, you've mentioned some points here a little bit, but if the kill chain isn't one of the main things we need to worry about, then what should be the future force structure and force design of the joint force? What kind of platform should they pursue? What kind of technology should they pursue? And understanding it's hard to define all of that. So if it's hard to define all of that, what would you prioritize?
Yeah. So, it's a massive question, and far be it from me to have the kind of the expertise to answer it in very specific ways. I kind of look at it sort of, in broader relief and say, what are the attributes of the force that we have, and what are the attributes of the force that we need? I would say in general, our current force consists of relatively small numbers of pretty large, very expensive, very exquisite, heavily manned, hard to replace systems. Ships, aircraft, vehicles, satellites, bases, et cetera. And there's a reason for that, that we have built that force over many decades, actually, on the basis of certain assumptions. We've assumed that we are going to be able to effectively hide and sort of evade detection, that we'll be able to effectively penetrate into an adversary's space and project power, that we'll have military overmatch whenever we conduct military operations against whoever our competitor is. That we'll be able to operate from sanctuary, forward bases, space, logistics, information, command and control, intelligence, and on. All of these things are going to be sources of sanctuary that will be there when we need them and allow us to fight the way that we want to fight with the things that we plan to fight with. And that fundamentally, all of this will enable us to kind of control the timing and tempo of any military campaign that we're involved in. And I think the problem is that those assumptions are being overturned in part because of the conscious strategies that our competitors have been following for 25 years, overturned in part because of just the march of technology. And what I would argue is that the place that we're now in leads to a set of very different assumptions that I think we're going to have to build the future force around. Hiding is going to be incredibly difficult. Evading detection is going to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Once found, surviving is going to be very difficult. That we may not, and likely will not, enter future battle spaces with technological overmatch. That we're not going to be able to operate from sanctuary because we have rivals that are actively seeking to deny us access to, again, space information, basing, spectrum, logistics. That all of this will be contested, degraded, or even denied. And then we're not going to be able to control the timing and tempo of operations. The problem is the fait accompli, as people have talked about. And I would argue this requires us, I think, to sort of build a force with a very different set of attributes that are based on these assumptions that are going to be capable and survivable or reconstitutable when these assumptions apply. And I look, from a force design sort of standpoint, I think that it's a force that has very different attributes than the one that we have, that's made up more of kind of larger and larger numbers of relatively smaller, lower cost, more attritable, more autonomous, more intelligent military systems. And when I say systems, I mean systems of systems, families of systems, networks of systems, how larger quantities of things actually work together in this way to enable that kill chain process of understanding, decision-making, and action on behalf of human beings. So to your question about, kind of what innovation to prioritize, and this goes back a bit to your first question, where I really fundamentally kind of focus in on is this question of sense making and targeting. It strikes me just in the past, several years, and possibly this is just a true statement in general, there's so much focus and emphasis, investment in fires and lethality, so much focus on that. And there's, a lot of reason that that's something that we do need to prioritize. But I think, again, sort of looking at this in aggregate from sort of the lens of the kill chain, I think the really hard problem that we have right now is making sense of the world. Where you have big spaces, hard adversaries, limited numbers of sensors, and ability to make sense of the world. And we just have a process in the United States defense enterprise that does not do this at all in a modern or scalable way. It is only scalable on the backs of enormous amounts of money and enormous amounts of people. And that just isn't going to work for the future, particularly against a rival like competitor like China. So again, I think this is also where these kinds of technologies, there isn't going to be kind of one single technology to rule them all. It's how those advanced and emerging technologies can be integrated to enable us to just operate fundamentally differently than we do now, from the standpoint not just of kind of an object detection algorithm in the abstract, but how do I really begin to sort of automate this sense making, target identification, target tracking process? Because if I can't do that at scales and at speeds that are going to be relevant in a great power or near peer competition, all of this kind of focus on fires and lethality is going to be interesting but irrelevant.
So thank you for that. If it's okay, I'd just like to draw you out a little bit. I mean, I think so. I heard loud and clear on sense making and targeting, ISR, making sense of the world, being able to target our adversaries, and then also I get that also means being able to pass that information back and forth as needs to be passed so that the kill chain can operate properly. Right. Within that area, are there technologies that you would say, hey, these are the things that for this, that it's my sense that you need to be thinking about or that these are things that should be kind of on the near the top of the list for innovation, for an increased funding? And I don't know if that means that you think that, well, we need lots of drone swarms, or we need lots of drones that operate much more autonomously over long ranges and are able to detect targets. I don't know if it means you think that really it's space where you need to invest, because you mentioned like seeing things all over the globe. And when you say that, the first thing that pops into one's mind, at least my mind, is space. And there's a variety of other things that I haven't even thought of or mentioned in that set. So are there like 2 or 3 things that you'd say, hey, here are some ones that we really should be paying attention to?
Yeah. I guess I would underscore again that I don't think it's going to be a particular technology area. I'm frustrated to a certain extent, when the DoD talks about, kind of prioritizing certain areas of technology like artificial intelligence. And I think many people can be forgiven for saying like, well, to do what? Like there's a million things that maybe artificial intelligence should do, but like, looking at it, and again, this is kind of back to the concept of the kill chain, like give me a framework, an intellectual framework that is relevant to engineers who are building technology and human operators, military operators that have to use it to help me understand like what is the value? How is this enabling me to work differently? So, whether it's, kind of AI, ML, advanced algorithms, edge computer processing to kind of push core network function out to the edge, whether it's kind of advanced robotics and a series of other things. I think the question is really more, how do they integrate to, and how are those capabilities integrated into some type of operationally relevant system? And, to me, it really boils down to autonomy. That to me is the thing that I think we really need to be prioritizing, and not just, autonomy in the sense of like, I have an airplane that can go from point A to point B without a human on the joystick, but the ability to automate mission, to have actual mission autonomy where that process of how am I sifting through massive amounts of information, deployed sensor data, kind of other big data sets. How am I generating insight and awareness, understanding, target signal from all of that information? How am I sort of tasking systems that enable me to better make better decisions about how I'm actually going to compete, what I'm actually going to do, and then obviously complete the swing in tasking and commanding and controlling actions and effects. To me, that question is how do we do that today? Incredibly expensively, slowly, manually, in ways that break and then generate mistakes all too often. I think the way we need to think about doing it in the future is fundamentally more around what are human beings best positioned to do, what should human beings be doing, and how much can we kind of move into the world of kind of more automated machines, processes, and systems, whether those are kind of, yes, large groups or packs of unmanned systems that are moving out to conduct forward reconnaissance, or if it's just, kind of software systems that are enabling that process of understanding, decision-making, and action to happen, where people are, so that we're actually bringing, data and understanding to human beings rather than having to bring human beings to data, which we do all the time. So, to me, it fundamentally comes down to this question of autonomy, which is really the integration of a lot of different emerging technologies.
Oh, thank you for that. I think that points the direction in which you see things. And I think you did a good job of kind of combining the discussion of AI, machine learning, processing, and autonomy, and how it needs to combine together. And like you said earlier, there isn't one technology to rule them all. So if we can shift just a little bit for a second. So if we talk now about force structure and force design and things in innovation we prioritize. So what about for defense strategy and our warfighting concepts? What kind of defense strategy and warfighting concepts should accompany a new force design and a new force structure? And to kind of give you something to shoot at. I myself, when I look at our defense strategies and a lot of discussion that's out there, I personally worry a little bit that maybe we focus a little bit too much about particular battles in particular places, and that perhaps we try to design our forces a little bit too much on these particular areas instead of something that's wider. And I often think historically, being a historian, that, the United States in the Cold War, they worried a lot about the Fulda Gap, but we never fought in the Fulda Gap. But we did fight in places like Korea, and we had a giant crisis in Cuba. So that makes me, concerned a bit. Or are we investing in the right places? Not just investing in the right places. Are we thinking of our concepts
right,
properly? But please feel free to shoot at what I just said.
No, so to be very clear, I mean, far be it from me to kind of offer like a really precise answer on kind of military concepts and tactics. I mean, it's kind of out of my area of expertise. I mean, what I guess I would say is, and this is somewhat building on your last question, I do think it is correct to focus on China as the pacing threat. I am in that camp that says that needs to be the priority. But I also would agree with you that I see the services in a lot of our defense enterprise kind of overly focused on that sort of worst day of the future when we have to close 1,100 kill chains in 24 hours, kind of in the South China Sea. We need to have that ability, because to me, that is the root of deterrence, right? Like, we didn't fight in the Fulda Gap because we deterred conflict in the Fulda Gap, to your question. So if our adversaries think that they would lose a conflict with us, or they would not be able to achieve their ends through violence or aggression, I think then we're winning. And we have to have the ability to sort of generate that deterrence in the minds of our competitors. Again, we didn't fight in the Fulda Gap for a reason. That being said, I do think that we are overly emphasizing a very sort of low probability, kind of part of what we would be generating kind of concepts and capabilities from. And I think that if you kind of, if we do that work well, hopefully, we will be spending preciously little to none of our future time engaged in that kind of actual conflict. What we are going to be engaged in, what we are engaged in now and will continue to be engaged in, is very sporty, great power competition. And from the standpoint of ConOps, I think this is where, I am inclined to agree with you that there's an overemphasis on lethality and an underemphasis on all of the things that enable lethality to be real. The sense making, the target tracking, the intelligence and targeting, all of that. The decision support tools, et cetera, command and control. So, when I kind of look for ConOps that really resonate for me in that sort of competition that we are like deeply engaged in now and will be engaged in the future, where there is 100% a military dimension to that. I mean, I'd probably go so far as to say that, you could make the case that we are at war today in the sort of pushing and shoving and kicking under the table that we are actively engaged with right now against our great power competitors. So, when I look at the things that the Marine Corps and the Commandant of the Marine Corps in particular have been emphasizing around reconnaissance and counter reconnaissance, deterrence by detection, the ability to understand what an adversary is doing before they do it, so that we can start playing offense rather than playing defense on their terms, because we just couldn't comprehend what that kill chain was that they were seeking to close against us until it was far too far along in our decision space. Our ability to really kind of creatively and effectively react was constrained to the point of really being a losing proposition. And again, when I say kill chain, I mean, in the phase of competition that we're in, a lot of that is going to be around sense making, targeting, reconnaissance, counter reconnaissance, and a lot of it is going to be non-lethal effects, non-kinetic effects, electronic warfare, cyber, information. These are the kinds of things that we're probably going to be resorting to much more so to kind of quote unquote close the kill chain, as compared to the sort of great power conflict, kind of most stressing type circumstances that I think we may be overemphasizing in the ways in which we're designing and building and sort of investing in future capabilities.
All right. So thank you for that. So if I take one more step further on the concepts and strategy piece, I suspect that you've read countless operational strategies, defense strategies, national military strategies, and other strategies of various kinds. As people in the government today move forward with creating a new national defense strategy, what are 3 top pieces of advice that you'd give them? And that could be things you would suggest, hey, you should do this. This is a great thing to do. It could also be, don't do this. I've read 1,000 of these things. If you do this, this isn't going to go anywhere.
Yeah. Yes. So to your question, I have fortunately or unfortunately read, my life's share of these documents. I'm not sure I'm the better off for it. I guess a few points that kind of jump out to me. First, I think the new team has to prioritize. I mean, that to me is the essence of strategy. So many strategy documents fail because they don't actually make choices. They don't actually define priorities. They want to give every kid a trophy. They don't want to offend anybody. So there's an impression left that everything is important. And when everything is important, nothing is important and no one is accountable. I think the 2018 National Defense Strategy did make progress in this. I mean, it wasn't a perfect document, but it defined priorities. It made choices. It said that we're going to do this, not that. We're going to go here, not there. And I think that's incredibly important. And unfortunately, it's kind of, it's rare in many of the strategy documents that I've read. I think the second question, generally has to do with this question of dominance. I think America has been dominant for so long, particularly militarily, that we are struggling to imagine a world in which we are not dominant. So I see a lot of writing and talking kind of in the defense world, in government, out of government, about things like maintaining military dominance, maintaining naval supremacy. And, the question that I kind of have to pose back is like, do we have that now? Would we consider us to be dominant now? Do we believe that we have deterrence now, conventional deterrence? Are we achieving that with our current ways and means? And my own belief is no. You could maybe argue, slightly a bit, maybe not, but like the trajectory is not right. You could argue the plane's in the air, but like when the nose is pointed at the ground, like this is not a good news story. And I think it's fundamentally because we have competitors who are forcing us into playing a losing game. And the thing they want us to do is to double down on the things that we think are going to generate dominance for us in the future. More platforms, more big ships, more expensive, aircraft and other things. Because they have been working very hard for a generation to develop the ways and means of killing all of this. So I think we have to change. And I think that we have to start to get our minds around how we are going to generate national defense in the absence of dominance. And to me, that's a part of what I write about in the book. Others can certainly pick at that, and we can argue about whether that's unrealistic, whether that's realistic, whether it's fatalistic. That's personally where I'm at. The final thing I'd offer is, with a strategy document, whether it's this document or subsequent guidance documents that flow from it, this team has to be specific. We actually have to start teeing up the programmatic changes that are going to determine which investments we make, which divestments we make. That has to be guided by strategy. Often strategy documents don't get into that. And often I see the failure of strategic implementation where the the Department of Defense fails to drive strategy down into programs, capabilities, budgets, posture, the kinds of things that are the real meat and potatoes of whether a strategy is real or whether it's not worth the paper that it's printed on. So I think particularly in the area of fielding advanced capabilities, the kinds of things that we've been talking here, I mean, that needs to really kind of be the leading edge of investment. And we have to think realistically about how that is going to play out. We can talk more about that, but to me, those kinds of operational advancements and sort of capability investments really need to be crystal clear of the things that are going to get prioritized, especially in a world where the defense top line flatlines, comes down, is volatile. Those need to be the things that we hang on to and ensure are protected and moved forward, rather than kind of engaging in the experience that we had over a decade with the Budget Control Act, where everyone circled their wagons around their large legacy programs, and we sort of burned all of our seed corn, and now we're sitting here surprised that we don't have enough, kind of new modern capability.
So number one, prioritize. Number two, dominance. Number three, be specific. I find all of those compelling, but the number two, dominance, that especially, that especially strikes with me. That often you read things and you think, well, this isn't the case today, and we're saying that we need to maintain or maintain our superiority, and you think that, well, are we not looking at things realistically right now? And like you said, shouldn't we, instead of thinking we're dominant, be thinking about how do we confront the fact that we're not?
Yeah, and if
go.
No, I was going to say, and if I can add a point to that, I mean, I think, kind of related to this is, and I'm prepared to be challenged on this too, but we have to get away from this idea that presence is synonymous with deterrence. That if we are kind of visibly, overtly present everywhere, that we are somehow de facto deterring adversaries. And what I would argue is that, in a pursuit of kind of global presence, driven by kind of a pursuit of global dominance, what we've really done is just kind of burn the readiness of the force, down to almost nothing, to a point that we can barely reconstitute it, particularly through the ways that we've been trying to do this traditionally, which I think, frankly, is just a circle that never gets squared. But oh, by the way, I think our adversaries have baked all of that into their plans. I think that that's something that they, are no longer surprised by, and they have been diligently building strategies to counter. So this notion that that sort of presence is equatable to deterrence, I think is something that we just really need to challenge and really start to think more deeply about what actually creates deterrence in the minds of our competitors. Things that we're doing, things that we're not doing, ways in which we are surprising them, keeping them off guard, things we're doing in the realm of competition, not just, in the realm of conflict. And I don't really know what the term integrated deterrence means yet. I've heard it from the administration. I don't know what integrated does to qualify deterrence, but I'm hoping that they kind of unpack that and specify that, because I actually do think this question of deterrence, presence, dominance, all these things really need to get sharpened in the upcoming strategy document to really guide the decisions that we're going to make, the things we're going to do, the things we're not going to do, invest in, not invest in, that sort of thing.
So I have a few more questions, but what I'd like to do is just ask one last question now, because I'm seeing we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. So I know that ends our moderate discussion just a little bit early, but I want to give the people in the audience a chance to ask questions and such. So I'm going to ask this last question, which isn't necessarily a small question either, but then we'll move to the Q&A right after that. So I think it's good to shift challenges a little bit. You've spoken about some of them already, but I think there's some deeper ones which, with your vast experience in Congress and with working with the Pentagon, that you have a particularly insightful view on. So what do you see as the internal challenges within the US government to the modernization of the joint force? I think it'd be great if you could specifically talk about the challenges within the Pentagon and then the challenges within Congress. And again, I'll share some of my personal biases, which may, or thoughts, which may be incorrect. I tend to think that innovation really is centered in what Congress would like and what the services would like. And I don't mean in any way, having worked for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to say the chairman doesn't have influence or the secretary doesn't have influence. But it seems like the services have a lot of responsibilities that are long lasting over time. And it seems like Congress is present for a long period of time. And those seem to be very dominant factors. But challenges.
Yeah. Yeah, we could spend the rest of the day talking about challenges. I guess, you know, the way that I would sort of try to roll it all up, the fundamental challenge that I see right now is that we are involved in an era of disruption. We have adversaries who are actively developing capabilities and concepts and strategies to disrupt the American way of war, to call into question the assumptions under which we build and use military power. And we're being disrupted by technology. Commercial technology, the places where artificial intelligence and autonomous systems are really being developed are laps ahead of where we are in the defense enterprise, I would contend. So at this time of sort of significant disruption that's acting upon us, my basic contention is that the problem is we have a system, a defense enterprise, what John McCain used to call the military industrial congressional complex, that we have made almost impervious to disruption. It is incredibly difficult to actually generate disruption inside of this system. And it's partly by design. Partly it's unconscious decisions that we have made. Partly it's because we've been surprised so many bad ways that we've consciously set up a system not to surprise us, for better or for worse, which means that we always get what we want rather than even when what we want is wrong. And when I look at it just at a deeper level, right? I mean, so much of the blame is directed at the acquisition system. And, I think the acquisition system probably deserves most, if not all, of the blame that it comes in for. But the problem is larger. It is the entire way in which we think about technology and capabilities and engage with it across the DoD and the Congress. We think in these very archaic Cold War type, kind of methodologies where we are going to think about generating the requirements for things that we're going to want in 10 years or more. We're going to build programs around them and budget for them, and we're going to go get them authorized, and we're going to get them appropriated, and then we're going to put together acquisition strategies to go buy it. And when you add this all up, you have a process of engaging with technology that takes a decade, if not longer. And what I would argue is in this period of disruption, when both the threat and technology are moving as fast as they are, it makes it almost impossible to get these things right. We have people sitting in the Department of Defense right now, good, diligent, hardworking people who are trying to define the requirements for technologies and capabilities that they think they're going to need in 2033 and beyond. And I just think that it's kind of fantasy. So I think part of this problem is how do we start to disrupt that? And I would agree with you that Congress has to be part of that solution. Because at the end of the day, you're right, the institutional knowledge, the institutional longevity exists much more in the services and much more in Congress. The problem is that where all of these different sort of parts of the process, requirements, programs, budgets, acquisitions, actually integrate, is at very senior levels like service chiefs and secretaries and members of Congress. And all too often, they have neither the time actually nor the expertise to even see what the decisions are that they have to make using the vast authority that they do have to generate real disruption. And more importantly than that, to get disruption to scale. That's the challenge here, right? It's the proverbial valley of death that so many of our innovative and disruptive ideas, technologies, capabilities, people, perish in because they can't make it across and get to scale and generate real change and real disruption at a joint level, at a defense-wide level. So I think with respect to the Congress, I think a lot of times the question is teed up, why won't Congress let us divest of old things that we want to get rid of? And that's fair enough. And believe me, like I was on the wrong side of many of those decisions. But I think we're actually looking at the question a little bit in the wrong way, because the real question is, why do none of the new things show up? Where's all the modern capability? And I think the context in which Congress has to make those decisions is often, you need to defund or divest from or kill something, some capability, some base, some production line that you and your, your representatives, your constituents, your stakeholders care deeply about. That is deeply meaningful to them, their livelihoods, your electoral future. You have to get rid of that today. But trust us, in 7 to 10 years to never, this amazing new capability is going to show up and all will be right with the universe. And Congress, has kind of played that Lucy in the football game before. And I think where they end up is, I'm going to keep what I've got for now. And when that new thing shows up, then we can have a conversation about what to keep and what to cut. The problem is that modern capability is not arriving on relevant timelines. And if it were, if we actually created the incentives for this to happen systemically, rather than through acts of like bureaucratic heroism and just accident, what I think is that question of innovation or disruption, would be framed more appropriately around how do I incrementally change? Not how do I make one sort of massive set of moves in one fiscal year, but how do I get rid of some of what I have and get a little bit more of some new thing that I think I need, so that it becomes more incremental rather than sort of one foul swoop revolutionary. That's the thing that I think Congress is really rather gun shy on. And I think that, if we were able to change the incentive structure in how we actually engage with, conceive of, develop, and buy modern technology, modern capabilities, I think it would change the kind of political and bureaucratic context of much of what I see as the challenges that we're wrestling with.
All right, more incremental then. All right, so have a few questions here. I'm going to group the first two together. And so I'll go ahead and I'll read most of the first one. It says, isn't the lesson from both Vietnam and Afghanistan that the kill chain is a tactical attribute, but will not determine strategic outcomes? In other words, the kill chain will determine the outcome of battles, not wars. And then the question goes on to say, like in Vietnam, Afghanistan won almost every battle, didn't win the wars. And overwhelming dominance in the kill chain may have worked, but it worked, it caused more problems in other senses. So the lesson is that isn't the kill chain a tactical attribute, but will not determine strategic outcomes. And then the other next question from Harlan Ullman is, why is it that the U.S. military has become highly adept at winning battles, and the U.S. adept at losing wars? Is this correctable? So I kind of see that the two questions seem a bit tied together to me, but please. Yeah.
So taking the first question first, I would challenge the contention that the kill chain is a tactical concept. I maybe should have been better in the book about making that clear. My own belief is that the kill chain holds at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels, because fundamentally what you're talking about is, how do I understand, decide, and act? And that process is occurring at the strategic level, where you have combatant commanders that are seeking to understand what red is doing, array forces, get inside of the decision cycle of a competitor and play offense rather than have to play defense on bad terms. So too operationally, so too tactically. And I really do think that, thinking about it that way, and I think the ways in which technology are actually changing how we're going to operate, what I see is actually much of these kind of artificial divisions that we've used to separate out things and sort of provide order to the universe just collapsing. Like, I don't think that, that sort of tactical, operational, and strategic will matter as much, when we're talking about hypersonic weapons that can close on a target in matters of seconds and minutes or tactical timelines. At the strategic level, where you have to be much more adept and much faster in figuring out what a competitor is doing, and then the ability to decide and act, to generate force, to position force, et cetera. Again, to me, that is all the kill chain. It is not, the tactical act of like finding a target, shooting a target. It pertains to competition. It pertains to conflict. And I would argue the sort of division that we make between intelligence and operations, the J2, the J3, I think also is going to collapse. Because again, the way technology thinks about it is, I'm bringing data in, and how am I processing, making sense of that, making recommendations, and what should be flowing out the other end is taskings for operations. So this kind of bifurcated Napoleonic world where it's like these people determine what's going on, and then they kind of walk across the hall and talk to those people who are conducting operations. Like, ain't going to work, ain't going to scale. So again, like I would contend that the kill chain, at least the way that I think about it, really is not tactical. It really applies to sort of every level at which we're competing militarily. To Harlan's question with regard to winning battles, losing wars, so accepting the contention that we're losing wars, I think we're losing wars not for military reasons. I think we're losing them for reasons of politics and policy. I think that we can be very effective at the military, kind of the tactical and operational level of military conflict. Now, I don't think we should like sugarcoat that either, because, for the better part of 20 years, we've also been, getting rocked around pretty good by insurgents using, very low cost, kind of commercial technology, drones and other things. So like we've been disrupted in that way as well, and maybe aren't as effective as we'd like to think that we are. But I do think that we've been rather tactically effective. But I think the reasons in which we've been failing at the sort of like larger level is because too often we've set objectives that are not achievable. We haven't aligned military power to achievable policy and political outcomes, end states for which we are trying to use military power to achieve. And I think, not to get into your area of expertise, but that's basically kind of how I think about the tragedy of Afghanistan, and many of the other places where we've been very tactically proficient, but strategically tragic. And I think oftentimes that comes down more to the ends we are using military power to achieve, and the realism or lack of realism, the ability or lack of ability to actually use military power on timelines that are relevant in a democracy to achieve the kinds of objectives that we're laying out here. I just see it as a fundamental disconnect or mismatch.
All right, so the next two questions, they're similar, and one of them's quite short. The other one's longer. I'll read the long one because it's got a good amount of tactical information there that I think is interesting. So the first question is from Peter Scharfman, and if he asks, if sense making is so critical in the future, what about capabilities to disrupt adversary sense making? So it's like the counter ISR fight. So I think that's a very relevant question, something that comes up a lot today in discussions. This next question here is a little bit longer, and so I'll go through it. It says, I wonder if kill chains are only or even the best way to break kill chains. It says, kill chain concepts evolved to address time-critical targets, mobile, stealthy, and highly threatening. The F2T2EA formulation for killing such time-critical targets, TCTs, was time-based and integrated, an end-to-end process chain, because breaking any link could break the entire chain. But some weapon systems are not aimed at TCT. Time is far less critical. For example, nuclear deterrent systems seem to be designed to hold hostage targets that are not time-critical. Strategic nuclear kill chain processes seem explicitly to be persistent, indeed they are, not time-critical, and engineered to survive links that might get broken. So for breaking kill chains, holding hostage some of the less TCT links of kill chains might add a lot to the capability to break TCT kill chains. So I thought that was an interesting complex question. But if you'd like to go ahead and tackle that too, or divide them up and use them and take them as you deem fit, that's great.
Yeah. I mean, great questions. You know, and there's a bit of similarity here with respect to, you know, how are we closing and how are we breaking kill chains? You know, so to the first question about the sense making function, the importance of sense making and targeting, I think that is the kind of one way in which we're you know, going to hope to continue to evade detection. It's going to be less about, you know, can I further optimize stealth? Can I, you know, come up with some other new unique material that allows me to hide? Because, you know, I fundamentally think this is going to be occurring, that sense making function is going to be occurring in sort of a data fusion, sensor fusion world, where it's great, you beat radar, but, you know, you're emitting an EW signature, an IR signature, you know, you're visible, you know, there's other things that you are emitting or making visible or detectable that is allowing a competitor to locate you and track you. Like, we're not hiding from single modality sensors anymore. And I think, you know, the way in which we're going to have to think actively about defeating that is exactly what I think the questioner is getting at, which is, you know, how do I defeat the sensor? How do I spoof the data? How do I beat the AI that's processing it? How do I make it see something that's not there, or you know, something different than is there? Or how do I generate, you know, so much noise that I'm capable of sort of hiding within it? Like, I think those are the kinds of questions, you know, that we're really going to have to answer here. And I think, again, that's where kind of the attributes of the force that I described is very valuable, where, you know, if I'm putting large quantities of systems out into the environment with the assumption that they are going to be detectable, that I am going to lose them, I'm going to be capable of replenishing them faster. You know, hiding becomes slightly less important, but it also perhaps becomes easier when each of those things can be actively trying to defeat the sense-making function of a competitor through detection, or rather through deception or related types of things. To the question, the second question, you know, if I understand it correctly, you know, I think that the kill chain is often focused on something that is time sensitive. There will absolutely be times in which, you know, sort of time sensitive, low latency is less important. I mean, the nuclear example that he offered is a good one, where I would argue, you know, we want to be very deliberate and sort of very manual in that process of determining whether we want to close that kill chain ever. But I think in terms of the different kinds of kill chains that we're going to have to close, you know, at sort of like tactical level, yeah, that may be more time sensitive. You know, if we're talking about, you know, kind of very strategic targets, that may be more time sensitive. If there are things that are playing out on longer timelines, we're still focused on closing kill chains, but it's going to take on a different form. And I think fundamentally, you know, as that time elongates, the focus is really how do I break, you know, how do I break what Red is doing from the standpoint of, you know, getting inside of their decision cycle such that I can start playing offense against them, rather than being surprised when they're playing offense against me, and I'm left in a pretty perilous position to try to defend myself. So, you know, again, maybe I'm misusing kill chain, or maybe I've redefined it in ways that make the concept meaningless. But I tend to think that there are going to be times in which you do want that sort of time-sensitive, accelerated process, particularly to you know, the kind of scales that we're going to need to compete in the future. But there are going to be other times, particularly I think in sort of competition, reconnaissance, counter reconnaissance, where these things are playing out on longer timelines, but there's still kill chains we're seeking to close. But they're not going to end in acts of violence. They're not necessarily going to end in sort of like application of lethal force. And we can afford to be slightly different in how we think about the timing and the application of, you know, what sort of military capabilities we're bringing to bear.
Yeah, I don't think you've, my personal opinion is I don't think you've diluted it too much, the concept. And I think that there's value in raising it up so that people understand the role it plays in our strategy and what we do today. And as an analytical tool, it's a pretty useful analytical tool to be able to think about what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah.
So the next question is from Mary Yelniker. And so her question takes us a little bit in a different direction, but you had mentioned globally integrated deterrence a moment ago. And so I think this gets right into that question, which I think is pertinent for everyone that's working on defense strategy right now. Certainly Secretary Austin believes it's important. So she writes, I absolutely agree with Chris that everything left of Bang is crucially important. Part of that is how we set up our partnerships so that we have the option to maximize our strength through coalition fighting. So do you think of diplomacy and economic policy as part of the kill chain? And if so, do you know if the Departments of State, Treasury, Energy, etc., publish derivative policy documents to the NSS akin to the NDS? So there's kind of there's two questions there. One about diplomacy and economic policy as part of the kill chain, the other about what other parts of the interagency do for their own policy documents.
Sure. I think with respect to the other agencies, they don't, to my knowledge, have a statutory requirement to produce, a national diplomatic strategy or a national economic strategy. I think, some secretaries have chosen to do so, some have chosen not to do so. So, to my knowledge, there isn't, sort of like analogous documents in that regard. And, I think to the question about, do those other agencies kind of have their own kill chains? I mean, look, if we want to really expand the, the analogy here, it's yeah, they do in much the same way that I think sports teams and, people in the business world do. One of the reasons I kind of embrace the concept is because what I found in my time is that the kill chain is a concept that everybody in the defense world knows and is familiar with in some form or another, and pretty much everybody outside of the defense world has never heard of. And I think that it actually makes it more kind of understandable to those many people who just see defense as a very opaque world that they have a hard time understanding. If you can actually say the value of what we are trying to do in this world is really no different from the standpoint of understanding, deciding, and acting that, many people go through in their day-to-day lives in one form or fashion. Now, I would sort of leave the analogy there and say, it helps to make it sort of more understandable. But I think for the purposes of what I'm talking about, certainly in the book, which is, kind of purely kind of the military domain, the defense domain, I wouldn't seek to kind of expand the kill chain into, an interagency concept. I would keep it much more focused on the defense world, where I think, what we are seeking to do is a bit more empirical, a bit more measurable, and I think a lot of what we do in the diplomatic world is a little bit more amorphous. It's a little bit more qualitative. And I just as soon kind of keep that in another kind of lexicon. I believe there's also a question there with respect to partners and allies, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. When I look at the strategic advantages the United States has, there are many. We have a ton of money, we have phenomenal technology, we have great people, and we have allies. And I think one of the things that, I write in the book, but not nearly to the extent that it deserves, is we're also going to have to think in a much more disruptive way about how we work with allies and partners. I feel like so much of the way we have approached this question for a very long time is we sort of pay it lip service. Allies are important, they're nice to have, but when we really have to do something sort of hard and meaningful, like bring them into the operational planning, like share actual information, intelligence, and technology, there's sort of this sense of well, the allies are going to hold our coat while we do the heavy lifting. And they're not really going to be kind of brought in as equals. And, there's some whom that applies much less to, but, my general feeling in the book is that the only way we're going to be able to compete at the scale that I think China sort of presents us is by multiplying our power with allies, recognizing that in order to detect and deter, we're going to have to be forward with actual combat credible military capability, and that's more often than not going to need to be based on the territory of allies and partners, which gets into the diplomatic and political sensitivities that they have of what we're there and what we're doing. So I think a lot of this comes back to thinking in ways that push our alliances in some directions that I think we've paid lip service to, but haven't nearly kind of explored the extent to which we're really going to have to operationalize these alliances, especially kind of in an Indo-Pacific area. And the final thing I'd say is, I think this is where I get, quite excited about what I saw last week with the Australia, US, UK, Australia, UK, US, kind of alliance here of like, let's actually start thinking at least of those three countries as a common defense industrial technological base. Let's actually think about common military programs, capabilities, technologies that we can develop and deploy and operate together in order to get to the kinds of scales that we're going to need, I think, to be effective.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a strong argument for the value of our allies when it comes to deterrence. And I think there's a tendency to look at our allies in terms of what are they providing us, how much additional military force are they really providing, or maybe even how much are they paying us. But their role is actually, I think, a little is partly that, but is also different. It's more based on allies help deter our adversaries from doing things. And that happens because the adversary has to fear that if they do something to the ally, that we'll come in and they'll have to fight a larger war.
Right.
That fait accompli actually isn't a fait accompli. You're going to end up in a war with the United States. And our allies help us signal that commitment. Well, for one thing, because we usually actually have a treaty alliance with them. And having that treaty alliance takes some effort. It takes effort to get to the Senate in the first place. It takes some effort to carry it on year after year. And there's some clear damaging repercussions if you go back on that treaty alliance.
Yeah.
But more than that, a lot of these countries, either in a small quantity or a large quantity, have US forces located in them. So if an adversary wants to attack that country and attack our forces, well, then that is war. So this relationship helps deter our adversaries, helps protect our interests, helps prevent them from getting closer to us and being more damaging to us.
Yeah.
But that's just my angle on which is.
No, so I would agree with that. I mean, the one sort of additional comment or point that I'd add is, I think those to whom we have committed to defend them, have an obligation to make themselves more defensible. And I know you'd agree with this, but I think the comment's like worth raising in the context of, many of our allies, particularly in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, where the challenge to them, I think, is no kind of less ambitious than the challenge to us, where there's a desire to have legacy platforms, things that look good in parades, things that service chiefs like to ride in. And the reality is what they need to begin doing is start building up, their own anti-access area denial complexes of their own. Fundamentally different investments focused not on mirroring the United States, being able to project power, but being able to fundamentally blunt any act of aggression, coercion, violence, conquest that one of those regional competitors might seek to engage in, so that if the United States rides to the rescue, we're not riding into a place where concrete has been laid and they're all speaking Mandarin. This is something that our competitor, our allies are going to have to do a better job, as are we. And I think the best way to think about that is how you do that, in conjunction in a way that multiplies power, multiplies capability.
No, I think that those are excellent points. So the next question is something that you will be aware of, and all of those who have worked in the Pentagon will be aware of. It's a concept that's had some popularity. So the questioner asks, is DFE, dynamic force employment, a symptom of thinking presence equals deterrence? Does its focus on unpredictability lend itself to challenging competitor assumptions? Or does it unnecessarily diminish LT readiness for illusory gains? And forgive me, I'm not sure what LT means in this particular case. I'm pretty sure it means long-term. That's been long-term readiness for illusory gains.
Right. So, the sort of movement conceptually to dynamic force employment happened kind of at the tail end of my time in government. So, I've not been regularly briefed over the past 3 years of like all of the intricacies of how the concept's been developed and implemented. I generally think that it's an improvement, right? I mean, back to my comments about presence, or the belief that presence equals deterrence. My understanding is the thinking behind dynamic force employment is generated to get out of that sort of predictable deployment presence cycle, to do things that are surprising to our competitors, where they have to sort of take note of, they just did a thing that I didn't think that they could do, or demonstrated the capability that I didn't think that they had. And now I've got to go back and sort of like think about what that all means. And oh, by the way, like what else they might have and might do. I generally think that's good. Now, like I would also then sort of caveat that by saying like dynamic is not an end in itself. And I think that's to some extent what the questioner is getting at, right? Like, we can, in the pursuit of dynamism, just like burn a hole, the rest of the way through the force, such that, we've kind of completely depleted readiness. I think there's also a question of, again, what really needs to drive this is not the dynamic part. It is what is actually deterring. Right. So it's like, surprise, an aircraft carrier showed up off the coast of Russia. It's like, I don't know to what extent Russia cares that much about that. I mean, maybe they do. Maybe they think that this isn't going to be that big of a problem for them to take care of if they have to. So, again, maybe that's an unfair example, but I think the question of what really deters, and then how we can sort of demonstrate that in ways that keeps our competitors off guard, if that is what is really going to be behind dynamic force employment, obviously doing it with an eye toward what do we want to reveal, what do we want to conceal, what are we willing to take risks in terms of present day readiness in order to demonstrate, kind of future state readiness, future state capability. Like these are the actual trade-offs, the sort of like 51-49 calls that are going to have to be made by senior leaders in the Department of Defense.
Yeah, and I don't know where DFE is going to go now. And I don't know how much is going to be still a part of our strategy and our daily operational or our daily deployment of forces or yearly deployment of forces, if that's going to change over time. It's I think like you, I was there when the concept was introduced. I heard it sometimes after I left the Pentagon, but I don't know really how it stands today.
Right.
So anonymous attendee asks, the key part of the question about tactical versus strategic was what other strategic directions do we need to be pursuing to ensure that we can both win the battle while also allowing us to win over civilians so they support us, not the enemy. So I think the point here is that a focus on a kill chain, or I think the question might also means that the tactical focus can result in turning an adversary's people, or turning the people who are trying to win over against us. So I think that there's what other strategic directions we need to pursue to ensure that we can win the battle and win over civilians so they support us and not the enemy.
Yeah. I guess again, what I would say is in terms of how we define the kill chain, I'd sort of move away from a very tactical kind of question, because I think the real, to me, it seems like what's really behind the question is sort of the pursuit of military effectiveness at the expense of sort of broader political and diplomatic and policy objectives, where you can be extremely kind of exquisitely effective militarily, whether it's tactically, operationally, or otherwise. But if that is, fundamentally at odds with your sort of strategic objective, your policy objective, then, you're sort of engaging in self-defeating acts. So, it's less to me about the kill chain. It's more about whether the military tool is aligned against, kind of the right policy and strategic objectives and outcomes, which are going to be broader than the military domain. And I think that's where, sort of the level of grand strategy comes in, where we're going to have to make decisions at times where we are going to decide not to engage in military acts, or we're going to consciously make our military, kind of operations less effective, or our kill chains less, fast. And we're doing that for some overarching policy objective. And again, I mean, all of this, I think, is very familiar in the context of, your experience in Afghanistan, other experiences of the past 20 years. And I don't see that changing. I think that's just a fundamental kind of element of grand strategy and the role that military force, plays in grand strategy, both for the better, but also potentially for the worse.
For the worse. So the next question is from Dr. Ralph Esbach, who's the foremost expert on Latin America. So his question gets to near-term versus long-term, and it's again about the national defense strategy. So he says, how should a national defense strategy balance near-term objectives, focusing on actions and investments to deter or defeat a particular adversary in particular regions, against the need for broader, more general, and longer-term military effectiveness? How can the strategy improve or assure long-term resilience, economic and technological, in support of military, which history shows is critically important to national defense, in addition to seeking greater effectiveness at expected near-term conflicts? So I think he's really pointed here to the kind of connection, at least the connection we all believe, that's between military strength and economic strength, and also the ability of our country to create new technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think at least if I'm understanding the question correctly, I mean, this is where I kind of have to sort of foot stomp, the comment that I make in the book, which is, the book is very consciously about the military domain, and it is not about, the diplomatic, the economic, kind of the other domains of national power that, as someone who spent a lot of time working at the State Department, I believe in like intimately, deeply are, I would actually argue, probably ultimately more important in how we're going to succeed or fail over the long term of this kind of strategic competition that we're now engaged in. And I think to the questioner's point, if we don't get these kinds of major decisions right at home, in terms of how we're thinking about our own sort of foundations of national power, economic, technological, financial, otherwise, fiscal, budgetary, in the United States government, we can have the most exquisite military with the most exquisite kill chains in the world, and I think we still lose. My point in the book was really that if we don't get the military piece right, we will be incapable of defending ourselves and we will lose. We can get the military piece right, but that is not the sort of sufficient condition for success. And I think that's where, if you ask me, I'm as concerned as I am about the state of our defense enterprise. I'm equally, if not more, concerned about, the state of our national budget, the state of all of this just sort of political dysfunction that I would argue is impeding the kinds of progress that we are more than capable of making as a country, completely outside of the military domain. Again, I come back to this kind of theme that, we have seen the problem and it is us. There is nothing that is just fundamentally like an Achilles heel that I think we have here that isn't insurmountable. And that's also why I'm an optimist. I mean, I think that most of the problems we're dealing with are problems of our own making, and there's no reason they can't be problems of our unmaking. And, to me, those are the kinds of things that if we don't address those outside of the military domain, we're not going to succeed in this long-term competition. And when I look at it right now, I have a hard time seeing the behavior and the decisions of our government, our society, and think that we are a serious country in terms of rising to the challenges that are being presented to us primarily by China.
Yeah, and if I could draw out Dr. Esbach's question a little bit. When I think about, you hear a lot that the Defense Department needs to worry about things other than military, other aspects. And there's some things that they can worry about and do things on. There's other things that are just more difficult.
Yeah.
So if I was talking about what can they do to improve economic growth or our ability to develop new research and technology, I might identify a few things, but like with economic growth, it's actually kind of hard to identify what can the military really do to spur that in a significant way. Technology is a little bit different because they can invest in things and improve the acquisition processes, et cetera, that might have some additional benefits. But so my question is, the thing that actually does immediately come to mind is the national defense strategy can scale back its objectives. It can ask for less so that other resources and focus can go into economic development and such. Is that a wise bureaucratic course of action or a suicidal bureaucratic course of action?
I guess, I mean, maybe the way I would describe it is just sort of, it's sort of mathematically incomplete. Like we're spending $750-ish billion on national defense. I mean, let's say that we radically cut that by $200 billion. Like we're not really moving the needle on much, right? I mean, when you look at the, the debt that is measured in trillions and the sort of, the hole that we're dealing with there. And I guess, more to the point, when you look at the trillions of dollars that are sitting on the sidelines every single day in national capital markets, just looking, non-ideologically for good things to do, good things to invest in, like, we've got to get away from this idea that the government is going to sort of direct the pace of technology for the country. Like, we're not living in the Cold War anymore. What I do think the Department of Defense can do for itself as a national security ecosystem is use the resources that it does have behind incentives that are better aligned to create new markets. But those are going to be defense markets. They may have, kind of spin-offs into the commercial world, as we've seen in the past. But I think fundamentally, what I want to see the Department of Defense focused on is fixing defense and creating the incentives to use the, I would argue, limited resources that they do have to unlock the other resources, the talent, the human capital, the people and money and things that can be brought to bear to solve the problems in the national defense space in new and different ways at greater scales. That sort of separate and apart from, I think the investments that we need to make in the society. But there too, I would argue, the government is not going to solve these problems, but if they can create incentives that bring, private investment to bear in creative ways, then we can start getting to the kinds of scales that we're going to talk about. But cutting, 9 figures off of the defense budget and giving it to, another government agency or civilian agency is it might help in some way, but it's not going to transform the problem. We've got to deal with the basic arithmetic of money in, money out, taxation, entitlements. That is, to me, the thing that is really dragging us down. And if we're going to solve a fiscal problem, that to me would be the one to focus on.
All right, next question, and thank you for entertaining my follow-up to Dr. Esbach. So next question is a question that I think is, well, something you and I have certainly thought about a lot, is how should the national defense strategy balance the prospect of a superpower war with Russia or China versus the higher probability of smaller wars with insurgent or terrorist forces, much like Iraq, Afghanistan, or Kuwait?
Yeah, I think twofold. I think that, we can't sort of completely disengage from, kind of global counterterrorism operations. I'm not at all in the book now or ever an advocate for saying give all the money to the pacing threat. This is the point about strategies and priorities. Global counterterrorism operations will continue to be a priority so that we can keep our country safe. I would argue that, it's going to be a smaller slice of the budget. It has been, right? I mean, this is the sort of great lie of the past 20 years. It's we haven't had any money to modernize because we've been spending it all on Iraq and Afghanistan and counterterrorism. It's no, we haven't. We've been spending a fraction of our budget on that, and the preponderance on, trying to modernize in many of the wrong ways and, a lot of other things. But I think with respect to counterterrorism, I think one answer is we've got to, obviously continue to prioritize the investments that we have to make in order to be effective in this domain. But I think the other piece of it comes to the policy decisions that we make and the sort of strategy decisions that we make about the ways in which we're going to do this, where we're going to sort of engage and where we're not going to engage. So, on the one hand, I would definitely not advocate for sort of thinking we can just put CENTCOM in the rear view mirror and everything is going to turn out. I mean, I'm deeply concerned about what Afghanistan is going to look like, in the near future, to say nothing of the long term. But I think, the sort of the flip side of that is being intelligent about the ways that we do engage, not overcommitting, not overextending, recognizing that while all of this is important, the sort of larger priority that we have to remain focused on is this great power competition challenge. And, I think in that regard, I think in this way, new technology can help us here too, right? This isn't the sort of traditional question of, well, I've been solving this one way, for 20 years, and I'm just going to have to cut my budget and lower my ambitions. It may be that new technology will allow me to solve this problem in a different way and potentially be just as effective or marginally less effective at lower cost. Like that is de facto like the definition of innovation, disruption, technological improvement. Like, can I do this more effectively with fewer people and less money at the aid of new capabilities and technology? And I think in that respect, so much of the thought about innovation and this kind of thing gets focused into the great power competition, where I would argue that really it's going to be these kinds of counterterrorism, kind of managing fragile states and regions, operations closer to home. To the question about Latin America, I mean, we have real military challenges and national challenges here in our own hemisphere. How can we actually use those problems to innovate, to kind of move forward in terms of new ideas and new capabilities that one are going to enable us to be more effective against those problems now and prevent them from becoming larger problems later, but might actually allow us to sort of create pathfinders that really enable progress against these larger challenges like China or Russia. My basic contention is, like, if we can't deal with kind of DJI drones and Iranian fast boats in the Middle East, we're probably going to have a hell of a time like closing the kill chain against the PLA Navy and Air Force. So like let's actually solve boundable and operationally relevant problems now in new and different ways, and that might actually help us get where we say we want to go at sort of like the larger defense strategy level.
Yeah, I think it's a good question between the most likely thing we're going to face versus the thing that's less likely but very dangerous.
Just to me, it's something that we're going to have to continue to manage. I'm not sure it's going to get remarkably better. I hope it doesn't get remarkably worse. It's just going to be sort of a steady state activity that we're involved in. And our objective is to do as little harm as possible, do the things that we have to do to keep ourselves safe at sort of the lowest cost and sort of most effective ways we can.
Yeah, and we shouldn't forget that a large portion of our military for over 70 years has been dedicated to deterring. And while it is capable of fighting, and sometimes fights extremely well, the funds that are going to those parts of the military, which isn't just the nuclear forces, they're there to deter. So they're serving a purpose. If all that funding was to switch into fighting low intensity conflicts, then we might have a much larger problem on our hand.
Yeah.
So we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to just come back to some final questions to kind of tie things all together. So, you remember I took note when you mentioned when we were talking about challenges, about more, you mentioned need to be more incremental to make some changes. So I think that ties in a little bit to this question I want to ask here, which is, looking ahead, maybe 10, maybe 20 years on what kind of innovation do you think we're ultimately going to see? Is it going to be to the level that you've described and you believe is necessary in kill chain? Or is it going to be something that's much more suboptimal? Certain things will be innovated on, certain things won't. Certain new capabilities will be present. A lot of legacy capabilities will be present. And if you think that suboptimal is the more likely, and I kind of think, I tend to think it's the more likely. What is that suboptimal? What does that look like?
Yeah.
What direction how's that going to look? Or maybe what are some different directions that could go?
Yeah. Despite being sort of generally an optimist, I mean, I don't think innovation in the government bureaucracy will be anything but suboptimal. I think by nature, it will be suboptimal. So to me, the question is, will it be sufficient? Will it be sufficient kind of compared to what our competitors are doing, the rate at which our competitors are changing? Will we be able to compete effectively? And, this is just where I'm deeply concerned right now. I'll come back to the question of sort of, innovation, as you mentioned, but I just still don't think we've appreciated the enormity of the challenge that we're dealing with in China. Someone was making the point to me the other day that I actually think it's empirically true that China is capable, based on its industrial base of shipbuilding, to produce ships faster than the United States is capable of producing advanced munitions to target them. This is the scale of the problem we are dealing with here. So like, how do we think that continuing to play the game that we are playing is going to get us, into a better place? Like, again, de facto, we have been put into the position of playing a losing game. If we keep doing more of the same, we will lose, innovation or otherwise. So like, first and foremost, like, we have to just stop. We have to just dispense with this idea. It's like no one escapes the Spanish Inquisition. Like, we're not going to get out of the trap that we are in by doing the same things that we've always done. Like, we're not going to win a shipbuilding war with China. At least I don't think we are, when we can't even afford the Navy that we do have. So how are we going to do this differently? And this gets to your question about innovation. It's not going to be optimal. I think it can be a heck of a lot better than it is today. Again, just by way of like putting this in context, we're talking, I see senior leaders in the Department of Defense talking about fielding, kind of half of the Air Force or half of the Navy, being unmanned, in a decade or more. It's like, why that long, right? I mean, there are no meaningful fielded, actually autonomous aircraft programs in the DoD. There's remotely piloted drones and, sort of legacy stuff that we're all familiar with, but like an actual autonomous capability that can do, a basic forward sensing mission, like a week ago, I was riding in a friend's self-driving car and it's changing lanes, it's exiting, it's like parking itself. Like, that is an inordinately harder problem than autonomy in the air domain. Why do we think this is going to take 10 years? Why are we talking about like building like a new legacy 4th generation fighter as a means of like getting our capacity up? Like, we need to embrace this, kind of movement to more autonomous capability, more mission autonomy. Because I think that's the only way we're going to be able to compete, particularly against a country that is like 4 times our size and inside of a decade is probably going to have a GDP that equals ours, and technological parity in a lot of very important areas. Like, we just have to recognize that the question that we're trying to solve here is what is sufficient to keep us competitive and create margins of advantage where we need them. And again, that's never going to be optimal, but it can be sufficient. But I still see the ways in which we are thinking, the speed at which we are moving, the timelines that we are giving ourselves to field relevant capability. We're thinking and planning for like the 2030s, and it's like, we're going to lose well before the 2030s. Like people know that, I hope. So how do we start accelerating these timelines in ways that are 100% achievable? Like, so much of what I sort of see people talking about with innovation is like photon torpedoes and witch magic. Like, we are talking about things that exist in the commercial world, technologies that we use on a regular basis. In many respects are less advanced than those capabilities that could begin to get us to sufficiency. Like, I just don't, I come back to this idea that like, are we serious or are we not? Because I know what America, when it's serious, looks like. That's the America that like got ready to win the Cold War in the early 1950s. Are we serious or are we not? And again, when I look at the sort of behavior that I see across Washington, across kind of this defense enterprise, like, I still don't think that we are. And I don't know what the reason is exactly. Maybe we think like things will just turn out well for us, or that we've got all the time that we need to get ready for this. I just think we're going to get lapped. So, again, to your question, it can be suboptimal. It will be suboptimal. Will it be sufficient and will it be fast enough is, to me, the real important question.
Well, thank you for that. So suboptimal, but the technology is here, so you have some optimism that we could get to what's necessary, the kind of force necessary to have the kill chain and disrupt the adversary's kill chain enough so that we're not lapped. But we don't know if we can do it. And I guess I leave somewhat optimistic, but also mildly discouraged, because if you don't know why we're unable to do it and why these challenges continue to persist, then I certainly don't know. And I think there are probably few people who do.
No, so I mean, look, I can take a stab at why I think we're not, is because like, I still don't believe that we have, like, it's a failure of imagination. We've been living in a world of American dominance and military dominance and naval supremacy and all the things that we've talked about for the past 30 years, and we failed to realize that that 30-year period in the context of world history is a complete aberration. And we think that it's a normal steady state. And the world we're kind of entering or re-entering, is a highly competitive world against a competitor that, when you look at the sort of sheer potential and kinetic power that it brings to bear, is unlike any challenge America has ever faced in its history. To me, that focuses the mind. That to me kind of creates a sense of urgency to sort of break through the impediments that we're talking about here of, look, like we've got to prioritize. Do we care about winning? Or do we care about being nice? Do we care about being fair? Do we care about, sort of checking every box and, kind of making everybody happy and sort of playing by the rules? Like, I think sort of the time for that has gone, and we've spent the better part of a generation sort of optimizing for the wrong set of virtues, or rather a different set of virtues than the ones that are now required, which is national seriousness to win. And, unless and until we sort of, kind of embrace that, I think, mentality, and unless and until we have that sort of fatalistic imagination to believe that if we don't, we will fall behind, and fall behind real fast, like not in the 2040s, not in the 2030s, then nothing else matters. Everything flows from that. And that's what I see just unfortunately still lacking, right? It's just like people say the right words, the actions don't follow. And I think a genuine part of the challenge is like many people are saying the right words and genuinely do want to change and are struggling with how. And I think that's the other part of this challenge here that we talked a bit about today. And that's a hard problem. And I don't sit here and claim that I have all the answers. But I do think that there are answers here with respect to the incentive structure to generate disruption conceptually in terms of capability, so that it happens more routinely rather than through sort of like acts of bureaucratic heroism and accidents. Like it has to be something that more deliberately happens. And to me, that fundamentally comes down to, are we creating incentives for it or are we not? And we haven't. And to a large extent, I would argue over the past few years, where we've kind of been more seized with this question, most of what is happening right now is kind of innovation theater. It is kind of talking about innovation. It's thinking that we're going to create more organizations and we're all going to wear hoodies and we're going to relax our grooming standards and, learn to code. And then somehow, like with lots of little small $1 million bets and new prototypes and science projects that never transition anywhere, we're going to win against China. And I just think that we have got to concentrate. We have got to concentrate our minds. We have to concentrate our investments. We have to think much more strategically and ruthlessly about, I made a lot of small bets, 90% of them failed. How am I going to scale the things that are excellent and keep going? So too with people, so too with organizations, so too with ConOps. Like we need that ruthless prioritization, or else I just don't think we're going to, be capable of doing the things that we say we need to do.
Well, that's a good ending as well. We need to take action. Can't just be theater. We need to ruthlessly prioritize and incentivize the change. And that's certainly a call for people to pay attention to. So thank you for the wonderful session today, Chris. We had a huge number of questions, which we managed to get through. We covered some major significant topics here. I hope people were listening to the advice you gave, including to the people doing the defense strategy. Some of the excellent points you made there about dominance, prioritization, specification. So we're really honored to have you here today.
No, the pleasure's all mine, and I always feel like I take more away from these things than I provide. So I hope there was some value offered, but it's been awesome. Honored to be with you, and thank you for the invitation.
No, thank you. And there was definitely value there. To everyone listening, thank you for your time today. Thank you for the fantastic set of questions. We really appreciate all of the enthusiasm. So we hope to see you again at a future event. There's nothing scheduled for next week, but we will be in contact for future events with future guests. Thank you so much, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you.